Sarah Martinez stared at the blank radio screen in disbelief. The green glow that had been her lifeline to the outside world for 3 months suddenly vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence that filled the underground communication bunker. Outside, the howling wind of the Antarctic storm continued its relentless assault against the metal walls. But inside, the absence of the familiar static and voices made everything feel dead. She pressed the emergency button 3 times, then 5 more times. Nothing. The backup generator hummed steadily in the corner, so power wasn't the issue. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she checked every connection, every wire, every switch she could think of. The main communication array that connected their isolated research station to McMurdo Base had completely failed. 14 people depended on that radio. 14 souls trapped in the middle of nowhere, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees outside and supplies running dangerously low. Dr. James Chen, the expedition leader, had been counting on the scheduled supply drop that was supposed to arrive in 2 days. Without radio contact, nobody would know they were in trouble. Sarah had been the communications officer for the Antarctic Geological Survey for only 8 months, but she knew the protocols. When the main system failed, there were supposed to be 3 backup methods. The satellite phone had stopped working a week ago due to the severe solar storm activity. The emergency beacon required line of sight to aircraft, which was impossible in this weather. That left only the old shortwave radio system, but it hadn't been used in over a decade. She walked to the dusty corner where the ancient equipment sat covered by a heavy tarp. The radio looked like something from a museum, with large knobs, analog dials, and a design that belonged to the 1940s. Sarah had seen pictures of similar equipment in her grandfather's old military albums, but she had never actually operated anything like this. The expedition members were sleeping in the main quarters, unaware that their connection to the world had been severed. Sarah knew she had only a few hours before Dr. Chen would expect the morning status report to McMurdo Base. She couldn't tell them about the communication failure without causing panic, especially since 3 of the team members were already showing signs of cabin fever and depression. As she examined the old radio, Sarah remembered something her grandfather had told her years ago. He had been a radio operator during World War II, stationed in the Pacific Islands. He used to tell her stories about how radio operators saved entire battalions by getting messages through when modern equipment failed. He always said that the old ways of communication were more reliable because they were simpler. Sarah found the manual for the vintage radio buried under stacks of newer equipment guides. The pages were yellow and brittle, but readable. According to the specifications, this radio could reach distances of up to 2,000 miles under the right atmospheric conditions. More importantly, it operated on completely different frequencies than the modern digital systems, which meant it might not be affected by whatever had knocked out their main communications. The setup process was more complicated than anything Sarah had worked with before. Instead of pushing buttons and selecting options from digital menus, she had to manually tune frequencies using analog dials. The instruction manual mentioned something about atmospheric layers and skip propagation that she barely understood. But as she began connecting the antenna leads and adjusting the power settings, she felt a strange sense of connection to all the radio operators who had used similar equipment decades ago. After 2 hours of careful preparation, Sarah finally powered up the old radio. The tubes glowed orange in the dim bunker light, and she could hear a faint crackling sound through the speakers. She tried calling McMurdo Base on several different frequencies but received no response. The atmospheric conditions were terrible, and the storm was creating massive amounts of radio interference. Sarah realized she needed a different approach. Instead of trying to reach their home base directly, she needed to find any radio operator who might be listening and could relay a message. She remembered reading about amateur radio networks that operated around the clock, with operators all over the world who helped pass emergency messages. She began scanning frequencies, listening for any sign of human voice in the ocean of static and noise. Hour after hour passed and Sarah's hope began to fade. The storm outside seemed to be getting worse, and she could hear the other expedition members starting to wake up in the next room. Soon, Dr. Chen would be asking for the morning communications check. Just as Sarah was about to give up for the night, she heard something that made her heart skip. Through all the noise and interference, she caught a faint signal. It wasn't clear enough to understand the words, but it was definitely a human voice speaking in what sounded like English. Someone, somewhere, was out there in the radio waves. Sarah grabbed the microphone with shaking hands and pressed the transmit button. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke into the device that represented their only hope for rescue. She had no idea if anyone could hear her, or if her message would reach anyone who could help. But she knew she had to try, because 14 lives depended on making contact with the outside world. The old radio crackled and hissed in response, and Sarah began to wonder if the faint voice she had heard was real, or just her imagination playing tricks after hours of listening to static. In a few hours, the sun would rise over the Antarctic landscape, and she would have to explain to the team why their lifeline to civilization had been cut, unless she could find a way to get a message through using this relic from a bygone era. Sarah Martinez stared at the blank radio screen in disbelief. The green glow that had been her lifeline to the outside world for 3 months suddenly vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence that filled the underground communication bunker. Outside, the howling wind of the Antarctic storm continued its relentless assault against the metal walls. But inside, the absence of the familiar static and voices made everything feel dead. She pressed the emergency button 3 times, then 5 more times. Nothing. The backup generator hummed steadily in the corner, so power wasn't the issue. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she checked every connection, every wire, every switch she could think of. The main communication array that connected their isolated research station to McMurdo Base had completely failed. 14 people depended on that radio. 14 souls trapped in the middle of nowhere, with temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees outside and supplies running dangerously low. Dr. James Chin, the expedition leader, had been counting on the scheduled supply drop that was supposed to arrive in 2 days. Without radio contact, nobody would know they were in trouble. Sarah had been the communications officer for the Antarctic Geological Survey for only 8 months, but she knew the protocols. When the main system failed, there were supposed to be 3 backup methods. The satellite phone had stopped working a week ago due to the severe solar storm activity. The emergency beacon required line of sight to aircraft, which was impossible in this weather. That left only the old shortwave radio system, but it hadn't been used in over a decade. She walked to the dusty corner where the ancient equipment sat covered by a heavy tarp. The radio looked like something from a museum, with large knobs, analog dials, and a design that belonged to the 1940s. Sarah had seen pictures of similar equipment in her grandfather's old military albums, but she had never actually operated anything like this. The expedition members were sleeping in the main quarters, unaware that their connection to the world had been severed. Sarah knew she had only a few hours before Dr. Chen would expect the morning status report to McMurdo Base. She couldn't tell them about the communication failure without causing panic, especially since 3 of the team members were already showing signs of cabin fever and depression. As she examined the old radio, Sarah remembered something her grandfather had told her years ago. He had been a radio operator during World War II, stationed in the Pacific Islands. He used to tell her stories about how radio operators saved entire battalions by getting messages through when modern equipment failed. He always said that the old ways of communication were more reliable because they were simpler. Sarah found the manual for the vintage radio buried under stacks of newer equipment guides. The pages were yellow and brittle, but readable. According to the specifications, this radio could reach distances of up to 2,000 miles under the right atmospheric conditions. More importantly, it operated on completely different frequencies than the modern digital systems, which meant it might not be affected by whatever had knocked out their main communications. The setup process was more complicated than anything Sarah had worked with before. Instead of pushing buttons and selecting options from digital menus, she had to manually tune frequencies using analog dials. The instruction manual mentioned something about atmospheric layers and skip propagation that she barely understood. But as she began connecting the antenna leads and adjusting the power settings, she felt a strange sense of connection to all the radio operators who had used similar equipment decades ago. After 2 hours of careful preparation, Sarah finally powered up the old radio. The tubes glowed orange in the dim bunker light, and she could hear a faint crackling sound through the speakers. She tried calling McMurdo Base on several different frequencies but received no response. The atmospheric conditions were terrible, and the storm was creating massive amounts of radio interference. Sarah realized she needed a different approach. Instead of trying to reach their home base directly, she needed to find any radio operator who might be listening and could relay a message. She remembered reading about amateur radio networks that operated around the clock, with operators all over the world who helped pass emergency messages. She began scanning frequencies, listening for any sign of human voice in the ocean of static and noise. Hour after hour passed and Sarah's hope began to fade. The storm outside seemed to be getting worse, and she could hear the other expedition members starting to wake up in the next room. Soon, Dr. Chen would be asking for the morning communications check. Just as Sarah was about to give up for the night, she heard something that made her heart skip. Through all the noise and interference, she caught a faint signal. It wasn't clear enough to understand the words, but it was definitely a human voice speaking in what sounded like English. Someone, somewhere, was out there in the radio waves. Sarah grabbed the microphone with shaking hands and pressed the transmit button. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke into the device that represented their only hope for rescue. She had no idea if anyone could hear her, or if her message would reach anyone who could help. But she knew she had to try, because 14 lives depended on making contact with the outside world. The old radio crackled and hissed in response, and Sarah began to wonder if the faint voice she had heard was real, or just her imagination playing tricks after hours of listening to static. In a few hours, the sun would rise over the Antarctic landscape, and she would have to explain to the team why their lifeline to civilization had been cut, unless she could find a way to get a message through using this relic from a bygone era. Bill went off the air for nearly 20 minutes, leaving Sarah alone with the crackling static and the sound of wind howling outside the bunker. She could hear the other team members moving around in the main quarters, preparing for what they thought would be a normal morning routine. Dr. Chen would be expecting the daily communications check in less than an hour, and Sarah still had no way to contact McMurdo Base directly. When Bill's voice finally returned, it carried news that was both promising and concerning. Antarctic Station, I've made contact with the Maritime Mobile Service Network Control Station in Hawaii. There's an old-timer there named Frank Morrison who remembers the wartime codes. He's willing to help, but there's a complication. Sarah gripped the microphone tighter. What kind of complication? Frank says the network can relay your message, but not through normal channels. The solar storm has knocked out most of the standard amateur radio repeaters and digital networks. The only way to get through is using what they call the human chain method, passing the message from operator to operator across the Pacific until it reaches someone who can contact McMurdo Base directly. The idea sounded both primitive and ingenious. Sarah had read about similar techniques in her grandfather's notes, where radio operators during World War II would relay messages across vast distances by passing them from station to station, each operator copying the message and retransmitting it to the next link in the chain. How long will that take? Sarah asked. Could be several hours, maybe longer, Bill replied. And here's the tricky part. Each operator in the chain needs to authenticate the message using the old codes before they'll pass it along. Frank says it's the only way they can ensure the message is legitimate and prevent hoax emergency calls. Sarah looked at her grandfather's notebook with new appreciation. What had seemed like dusty old military procedures were now the key to saving 14 lives. She quickly flipped through the pages, looking for additional authentication codes that might be needed for multiple relay operations. I understand, Sarah told Bill. What do I need to do? Frank wants you to transmit your emergency message using the standard military emergency format from World War II. That means specific wording, proper message structure, and authentication codes at the beginning and end. Can you handle that? Sarah found the section in her grandfather's notebook that dealt with emergency message formatting. The procedure was quite different from modern communications. Instead of just explaining the situation, she needed to structure the message with specific headings, priority codes, and authentication sequences that would allow each radio operator in the chain to verify its authenticity. I'm ready, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Right then, I'll connect you directly to Frank in Hawaii. He'll take your message and start the relay chain. Remember, speak slowly and clearly. These old radios don't have the clarity of modern equipment. There was a brief pause, then a new voice came on the frequency. Frank Morrison sounded like he was well into his 70s, but his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had handled emergency communications for decades. Antarctic Station. This is Whiskey Hotel 6 Tango in Honolulu. I understand you have emergency traffic that needs to reach McMurdo Base. Before we begin, I need you to authenticate using the rescue protocol sequence. Sarah carefully read the authentication codes from her grandfather's notebook. Pronouncing each letter and number exactly as written, Frank acknowledged each part of the sequence, and she could hear him writing down the codes on his end. Authentication accepted, Frank finally announced. Your grandfather served with honor, young lady. Now let's get your people the help they need. Transmit your emergency message using the standard format. Sarah took a deep breath and began speaking in the precise, formal language that her grandfather's notes specified for emergency traffic. She identified their station, gave their exact geographic coordinates, described their personnel count and current supply status, and explained the nature of their emergency. She mentioned the failed communications equipment, the approaching storm, and the critical need for the scheduled supply drop to proceed as planned. Most importantly, she requested that McMurdo Base be notified immediately of their situation and given their exact coordinates for the supply drop. She concluded the message with the proper authentication codes and her radio call sign. When she finished, Frank read back the entire message to ensure he had copied it correctly. Sarah was impressed by his professionalism and attention to detail. Every word, every number, every code sequence was repeated exactly as she had transmitted it. Message copied and verified, Frank announced. I'm starting the relay chain now. First link will be to a station in American Samoa, then to New Zealand, then hopefully to someone who can reach McMurdo Base directly. Each operator will authenticate and retransmit your message. How will I know if it gets through? Sarah asked. I'll stay on this frequency and give you updates as each link in the chain confirms receipt of your message. But I have to warn you, some of these operators are in their 80s and 90s. They don't operate their radios as frequently as they used to, and atmospheric conditions are still poor. It might take several attempts to complete the chain. Sarah settled in for what she knew would be a long wait. Through the walls of the communication bunker, she could hear Dr. Chen's voice calling her name. The morning communications check was about to begin, and she would have to explain why their normal radio systems weren't working. But for the first time since the communications failure, she had hope that help was on the way. Dr. Chen's footsteps approached the communication bunker, and Sarah knew she couldn't delay the inevitable conversation any longer. She quickly noted the frequency where Frank was coordinating the relay chain and switched the old radio to standby mode. When Chen opened the door, he found Sarah sitting at the main communication console, apparently running routine equipment checks. Good morning, Sarah. Ready for the daily check-in with McMurdo? Chen asked, settling into a chair beside the communication desk. At 52, he was an experienced expedition leader who had spent 8 previous seasons in Antarctica. But Sarah could see the stress lines around his eyes that had deepened over the past weeks of difficult weather conditions. Sarah took a deep breath. Dr. Chen, we have a problem. The main communication array went down during the night. I've been working on it for hours, but the system appears to have suffered a complete failure. The color drained from Chen's face. He understood better than anyone what loss of communication meant in their isolated position. What about the backup systems? The satellite phone has been down for a week due to solar storm activity. The emergency beacon only works if aircraft are in the area, which isn't possible in this weather. However, I've been trying to establish contact using some older equipment. Sarah gestured toward the vintage radio in the corner. Chen walked over to examine the old radio setup. I didn't even know this equipment was still here. Does it work? It works, but it's complicated. This radio operates on completely different principles than our modern digital systems. I've managed to make contact with an amateur radio operator in Australia who's helping coordinate an emergency message relay. Before Chen could respond, Frank's voice crackled from the radio speaker. Antarctic Station, this is Whiskey Hotel 6 Tango with relay update. Please respond. Sarah quickly switched back to the active frequency. This is Antarctic Station. Go ahead with your update. First relay link successful, Frank announced. Your message has been received and authenticated by the operator in American Samoa. He's now attempting contact with the New Zealand link. Stand by for further updates. Chen listened with growing amazement as Sarah explained the relay chain process. The idea that a message could be passed from operator to operator across the Pacific using equipment and procedures from World War II seemed almost impossible in an age of satellite communications. And internet connectivity. How long will this take? Chen asked when Sarah finished her explanation. Frank estimates several hours for the complete chain. But Dr. Chen, there's something else you need to know. The procedure I'm using requires authentication, codes that my grandfather used during World War II. The amateur radio operators won't relay emergency messages unless they're convinced the request is legitimate. Sarah showed Chen her grandfather's notebook, explaining how the wartime codes and procedures were now their lifeline to the outside world. Chen examined the pages with fascination, reading the detailed notes about radio protocols that had helped win a global war decades before either of them was born. Your grandfather sounds like he was quite a man, Chen said. I think we need to gather the team and explain the situation. They deserve to know what's happening, and some of them might be able to help. Sarah agreed, but suggested they wait for the next update from the relay chain before briefing the entire team. If the message failed to get through, they would need to consider other options, including the possibility of attempting to repair the main communication system or sending a team to higher ground where the emergency beacon might be more effective. An hour later, Frank's voice returned with mixed news. Antarctic Station, we have partial success. The New Zealand operator received your message and has confirmed authentication. However, he reports that direct contact with McMurdo Base is not possible due to atmospheric conditions. He's attempting to reach a station in Christchurch that maintains regular contact with Antarctic operations. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. They were so close to establishing a complete communication link, but each step in the chain presented new challenges. The solar storm that had knocked out their modern equipment was also affecting the propagation of radio waves across the vast Pacific Ocean. How much longer? Sarah asked. The Christchurch operator comes on the air at 1400 hours local time, Frank replied. That's about 3 hours from now. The New Zealand operator will keep trying to establish contact, but we might have to wait for the scheduled time. Chen looked at his watch. The supply aircraft from McMurdo was scheduled to arrive the following morning, weather permitting. If they couldn't establish contact within the next 12 hours, the pilot would have no way of knowing about their communication problems or their exact supply needs. We need to tell the team, Chen decided. But let's present this as a temporary setback, not a crisis. Some of them are already showing signs of stress from the isolation and weather conditions. Sarah agreed to continue monitoring the relay chain while Chen briefed the other expedition members. As he left the communication bunker, Frank's voice came through the speaker again with an unexpected development. Antarctic Station. I have some additional information that might interest you. The operator in American Samoa has been checking with other stations in the Pacific, and they report unusual radio propagation conditions that might actually work in our favor. There's a phenomenon called auroral skip that sometimes occurs during solar storms. It can bounce radio signals off the aurora in ways that aren't normally possible. Sarah grabbed her grandfather's notebook and searched for information about auroral propagation. She found several pages of notes about how radio operators during the war had learned to use atmospheric disturbances to their advantage, bouncing signals off different layers of the ionosphere to reach destinations that were normally out of range. Frank, can you explain how auroral skip might help us? Well, the aurora over Antarctica right now is quite active due to the solar storm. If we time it right, we might be able to bounce a signal directly from your location to McMurdo Base without going through the relay chain. But it would require precise timing and frequency selection. Sarah felt a surge of excitement. If they could establish direct contact with McMurdo Base, they could eliminate the delays and uncertainties of the relay chain. But it would also require her to understand radio propagation techniques that were far more complex than anything she had learned in her modern communications training. She opened her grandfather's notebook to the section on auroral propagation and began reading his detailed notes about how to predict and use atmospheric conditions for long-distance radio communication. Sarah's grandfather had been thorough in his documentation of auroral propagation techniques. His notes described how solar particles, interacting with Earth's magnetic field, created layers of ionization in the upper atmosphere that could reflect radio waves back to Earth at much greater distances than normal. During World War II, radio operators in the Pacific had learned to monitor aurora activity and adjust their transmission frequencies accordingly. The key is timing, her grandfather had written. Aurora activity follows patterns that can be predicted if you know what to look for. Maximum propagation occurs during periods of high geomagnetic activity, usually lasting 20-30 minutes at a time. Frank's voice came through the radio with updates on atmospheric conditions. Antarctic Station, I'm monitoring space weather reports from Australia's Space Weather Bureau. They're showing strong auroral activity over the southern polar region right now. If your grandfather's notes are correct, you might have a window of opportunity in about 2 hours. Sarah studied her grandfather's frequency charts and propagation tables. The calculations were complex, requiring her to factor in the distance to McMurdo Base, the current solar activity levels, and the optimal frequency for auroral reflection. Unlike modern digital radios that automatically selected frequencies, the old equipment required manual tuning based on atmospheric conditions. Dr. Chen returned to the communication bunker with news about the team briefing. I've explained the communication situation to everyone. There's some concern, but no panic. Dr. Williams asked if she could help. She has some background in atmospheric physics that might be useful for understanding radio propagation. Dr. Rachel Williams joined them in the communication bunker, bringing her laptop computer loaded with atmospheric modeling software. As a climate researcher, she had extensive knowledge of upper atmosphere physics and was fascinated by the challenge of using aurora activity for radio communication. This is brilliant, Williams said after Sarah explained the auroral propagation theory. The solar storm that knocked out your modern equipment is creating exactly the conditions needed for this old technique to work. It's like the atmosphere is providing a natural radio relay system. Working together, Sarah and Williams calculated the optimal frequency and timing for an auroral skip transmission to McMurdo Base. Williams' atmospheric model showed that the aurora over Antarctica was intensifying and would reach peak activity in approximately 90 minutes. We'll have about a 20-minute window, Williams explained. The auroral layer needs to be at exactly the right altitude and density to reflect our signal. Too early or too late, and the radio waves will either be absorbed or pass through without reflection. Sarah began preparing the old radio for the direct transmission attempt. The procedure was more complex than anything she had tried before, requiring precise frequency control and power management. Her grandfather's notes mentioned that auroral propagation could be unpredictable, sometimes working perfectly and other times failing completely, despite apparently identical conditions. Frank continued to provide updates from his coordination station in Hawaii. The relay chain is still working on your original message. The Christchurch operator should be coming online in about an hour, but if you can establish direct contact with McMurdo, that would be much more reliable than depending on multiple relay links. As they waited for optimal auroral conditions, Sarah made another discovery in her grandfather's notebook. He had documented a special emergency call procedure specifically designed for auroral propagation attempts. Instead of using normal radio protocol, operators were supposed to use a distinctive calling pattern that would be easily recognized even through the distortion and noise typical of auroral reflections. Listen to this, Sarah said, reading from the notebook. For auroral emergency calls, transmit your call sign 3 times, followed by the emergency authentication code, then repeat the entire sequence after a 5-second pause. The repetition pattern helps receiving stations recognize the signal as legitimate emergency traffic, even if individual words are distorted. Dr. Williams monitored her atmospheric data as the aurora activity approached its predicted peak. The geomagnetic field is becoming very active. If we're going to try this, now is the time. Sarah carefully tuned the radio to the frequency calculated for optimal auroral reflection. The radio's analog meters showed power output and antenna matching levels that looked acceptable according to her grandfather's notes. She picked up the microphone, knowing that the next few minutes could determine whether 14 people would be rescued or remain stranded in one of the most isolated places on Earth. McMurdo Base, McMurdo Base, McMurdo Base, Sarah called into the microphone, using the precise cadence and timing specified in her grandfather's emergency procedures. This is Antarctic Geological Survey Station, emergency traffic, authentication code Delta 779. McMurdo Base, McMurdo Base, McMurdo Base. This is Antarctic Geological Survey Station, emergency traffic, authentication code Delta 779. The response was immediate and startling. Through the atmospheric noise and distortion, a clear human voice came back from McMurdo Base. Antarctic Geological Survey Station, this is McMurdo Base Communications. We have been trying to contact you for 8 hours. Your scheduled communication check was missed, and we were preparing search and rescue operations. Sarah could barely contain her excitement, but she forced herself to follow the proper emergency communication procedures. She transmitted their exact location coordinates, personnel count, supply status, and equipment failures. Most importantly, she confirmed that they urgently needed the scheduled supply drop to proceed as planned the following morning. The McMurdo operator acknowledged each piece of information and confirmed that the supply aircraft was already prepared for departure. We will relay your status to the flight crew immediately. They have been monitoring weather conditions and expect to be able to reach your location as scheduled. Dr. Chen grabbed Sarah's arm with relief and gratitude written across his face. Dr. Williams was busily taking notes about the atmospheric conditions that had made the contact possible. Through the radio speaker, they could hear the professional calm of the McMurdo operator as he coordinated their rescue with various Antarctic support services. But even as Sarah felt overwhelming relief at establishing contact, she realized their communication link was fragile and temporary. The auroral conditions that had made this contact possible were already beginning to change, and they might not have another opportunity for direct communication until their regular equipment could be repaired. The McMurdo base operator worked quickly to gather all necessary information while the auroral propagation window remained open. Sarah could hear the slight distortion in his voice as the radio waves bounced off the unstable aurora layers, but the communication remained clear enough for detailed coordination. Antarctic Geological Survey Station, we need confirmation of your supply requirements, the operator transmitted. Our manifest shows medical supplies, food rations for 14 people, fuel and replacement communication equipment. Do you have any additional urgent needs? Sarah looked at Dr. Chen, who quickly consulted a supply list he had prepared weeks earlier. Confirmed on all items, Sarah replied. We also urgently need the replacement communication equipment to restore our primary systems. Our current contact method is temporary and depends on atmospheric conditions that won't last. Understood. The supply aircraft will carry complete communication system replacements and a technician qualified to install the equipment. Estimated arrival at your location is 800 hours tomorrow morning, weather permitting. Dr. Williams monitored her atmospheric data with growing concern. The geomagnetic activity that was enabling their communication was becoming more erratic, and she could see signs that the auroral layer was beginning to destabilize. Sarah, we probably have less than 5 minutes before we lose this propagation path. Sarah quickly transmitted the most critical remaining information to McMurdo Base. She confirmed their exact GPS coordinates, described the landing conditions near their station, and provided weather observations from their instruments. Most importantly, she established a backup communication schedule in case they could recreate the auroral propagation conditions later. McMurdo Base, if we lose contact, we will attempt to re-establish communication using the same frequency and method every 2 hours until the supply flight arrives. Our atmospheric specialist believes we may have additional propagation windows as the solar storm continues. Copy that, Antarctic Station. We will monitor this frequency every 2 hours for your check-ins. If you are unable to re-establish contact, the supply flight will proceed to your coordinates as scheduled. They have emergency communication equipment that should allow contact, even if atmospheric conditions remain poor. The radio signal was beginning to fade and distort as the auroral layers shifted. Sarah transmitted her final message using the authentication codes from her grandfather's notebook, confirming that McMurdo Base should consider their emergency status resolved pending arrival of supplies and equipment. As the auroral propagation window closed, the radio signal from McMurdo Base faded into static. Sarah switched frequencies and contacted Frank in Hawaii to report the successful direct communication and cancel the relay chain operation. Outstanding work, young lady, Frank transmitted with obvious satisfaction. That was some of the finest emergency radio work I've witnessed in 30 years of amateur radio operation. Your grandfather would be very proud. Dr. Chen gathered the entire expedition team in the main quarters to announce the successful communication with McMurdo Base. The relief was immediate and visible as team members realized that their isolation would end with the arrival of supplies and new equipment the following morning. But even as the team celebrated, Sarah continued monitoring atmospheric conditions with Dr. Williams. The solar storm showed signs of intensifying rather than diminishing, which could create both opportunities and challenges for maintaining communication with the outside world. The interesting thing about this situation, Williams explained, is that the same solar activity that knocked out our modern digital systems is enabling these old analog techniques to work better than normal. It's like we've gone back in time to an era when radio communication required real skill and understanding of atmospheric physics. Sarah spent the remaining daylight hours studying her grandfather's notebook more carefully. She realized that the successful contact with McMurdo Base was just the beginning. They needed to maintain regular communication to coordinate the supply flight, provide weather updates, and ensure that the rescue operation proceeded smoothly. Her grandfather's notes contained detailed information about predicting auroral activity patterns during solar storms. He had developed techniques for recognizing the early signs of propagation windows and calculating optimal frequencies for different atmospheric conditions. These skills had been essential for military communications during World War II, when radio operators couldn't depend on modern forecasting tools. As evening approached, Sarah attempted to re-establish contact with McMurdo Base using her grandfather's prediction methods. The atmospheric conditions had changed significantly since the morning contact, requiring different frequencies and transmission techniques. After an hour of careful frequency scanning and timing adjustments, she successfully made contact with McMurdo Base again. The evening communication check confirmed that the supply aircraft was prepared for departure and that weather conditions along the flight route appeared acceptable. Antarctic Station. This is McMurdo Base with flight update, the operator transmitted. Aircraft departure is confirmed for 0600 hours local time. Flight crew reports excellent weather conditions and expects to reach your location on schedule. They will establish radio contact with you approximately 30 minutes before arrival. Sarah acknowledged the flight information and provided an updated weather report from their station instruments. The storm that had been battering their location for 3 days was finally beginning to weaken, with wind speeds dropping and visibility improving gradually. That evening, as the team prepared for what they hoped would be their last night of isolation, Sarah made one more important discovery in her grandfather's notebook. He had written detailed instructions for emergency communication procedures during aircraft rescue operations, including specific frequencies and protocols that pilots use to coordinate with ground stations during supply drops. Tomorrow morning will be critical, Sarah explained to Dr. Chen and Dr. Williams. When the supply aircraft approaches, we need to be able to provide real-time weather updates, landing guidance, and coordinate the actual supply drop. My grandfather's notes show that this requires different radio techniques than what we used for long-distance communication. The notebook contained frequency charts for aircraft communication, procedures for providing landing guidance using radio signals, and emergency protocols in case the supply drop encountered problems. Sarah realized that her crash course in World War II radio techniques wasn't over yet. The most important test would come when 14 lives depended on her ability to guide a rescue aircraft to their remote location. As she settled in for a few hours of sleep before the morning rescue operation, Sarah felt a profound connection to her grandfather and all the radio operators who had used these same techniques to save lives during wartime. The old equipment and forgotten procedures that had seemed obsolete in an age of satellite communication had proven to be their salvation. When modern technology failed, Dr. Williams continued monitoring atmospheric conditions throughout the night, tracking the solar storm activity and predicting optimal communication windows for the morning aircraft contact. Her scientific expertise combined with the practical knowledge in Sarah's grandfather's notebook gave them the best possible chance of coordinating a successful rescue operation. The vintage radio continued its steady operation through the night, its analog tubes glowing softly in the communication bunker. In a few hours, it would carry the voices that would guide their rescuers through the Antarctic wilderness to bring them safely home. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Antarctic Research Station, with visibility better than it had been in days. Sarah had been awake since before sunrise, monitoring radio frequencies and atmospheric conditions, while the rest of the team prepared for the arrival of their rescue flight. Dr. Williams reported that the solar storm was beginning to weaken, but auroral activity remained strong enough to support radio communication. At exactly 0730 hours, Sarah heard the first faint transmission from the approaching aircraft. Antarctic Geological Survey Station. This is McMurdo Supply Flight 72. Approximately 40 miles from your location. Request weather report and landing guidance. Sarah's heart raced as she picked up the microphone. This was the moment when all of her grandfather's training would be put to the ultimate test. She consulted his notes on aircraft communication procedures and began transmitting the critical information that would guide their rescuers to safety. McMurdo Supply Flight 72. This is Antarctic Geological Survey Station. Current weather conditions. Wind from southeast at 15 knots, visibility unlimited. Temperature minus 28 degrees. Ceiling clear. Landing area is prepared and marked. Request you contact us when visual with our station. The pilot's voice came back strong and professional. Copy weather report. We have GPS coordinates for your location, but we'd like radio guidance for the final approach. The terrain in your area shows several possible landing sites. Sarah found her grandfather's section on aircraft landing guidance and discovered detailed procedures that had been used to guide military aircraft to remote landing strips during the war. The techniques involved using radio signal strength and directional procedures to help pilots locate landing areas when visual navigation was difficult. Supply Flight 72, we can provide radio guidance using signal strength indication. As you approach our coordinates, we will transmit continuously on this frequency. Your radio signal strength to us will indicate your direction and distance from our position. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah maintained constant radio contact with the approaching aircraft, providing navigation guidance based on the signal strength procedures documented in her grandfather's notebook. Dr. Chen and several team members had gone outside to prepare visual signals and mark the landing area, while Sarah remained in the communication bunker coordinating the approach. Antarctic Station. I have visual contact with your station, the pilot finally announced. I can see your landing markers and personnel on the ground. Beginning approach for supply drop. Sarah felt overwhelming relief as she watched through the bunker window while the aircraft circled their station. The plane was a sturdy twin-engine aircraft designed for Antarctic operations, and she could see supply containers attached to parachute systems being prepared for the drop. Supply Flight 72. Landing area is clear. Wind conditions remain stable. You are cleared for supply drop operation. The aircraft made several passes over their station, releasing supply containers with remarkable precision. Each container landed within 100 yards of their designated drop zone, its parachute system working perfectly in the light wind conditions. Sarah maintained radio contact throughout the operation, providing updates on wind conditions and confirming successful delivery of each container. But the most important cargo remained. On the aircraft, the communication technician and replacement equipment that would restore their connection to the outside world. The pilot announced that he needed to land to deliver this critical equipment, rather than attempting another parachute drop. Using her grandfather's landing guidance procedures, Sarah helped talk the pilot through a safe landing on the prepared ice runway near their station. The aircraft touched down smoothly and taxied to a stop near the station buildings, ending their 3-day isolation from civilization. As the aircraft engines shut down and the rescue team disembarked, Sarah felt an incredible sense of accomplishment and gratitude. The forgotten radio techniques and authentication codes from World War II had not only saved 14 lives, but had also demonstrated the enduring value of fundamental communication skills and human ingenuity. The communication technician who emerged from the aircraft was amazed to learn how Sarah had maintained contact with McMurdo Base using vintage equipment and wartime procedures. I've never seen anything like this, he said, examining the old radio setup. Modern systems are more efficient, but they're also more fragile. These old radios just keep working no matter what happens to them. Within hours, the technician had installed new digital communication equipment that restored their normal contact with McMurdo Base in the outside world. But Sarah kept the vintage radio operational as a backup system, knowing that the techniques she had learned from her grandfather's notebook might be needed again. Someday, Dr. Chen's official report to the Antarctic Research Committee praised Sarah's exceptional resourcefulness and communication expertise under emergency conditions. But for Sarah, the real reward was the knowledge that she had honored her grandfather's memory by using his skills and knowledge to save lives when it mattered most. The leather-bound notebook returned to its place among Sarah's personal belongings, but she had copied the most important procedures into her own communication manual. She had learned that the fundamental principles of emergency communication, clear procedures, authentication protocols, and understanding of atmospheric conditions, were just as relevant today as they had been during World War II. As the rescue aircraft prepared to transport the team back to McMurdo Base, Sarah took one last look at the vintage radio that had been their lifeline to the world. The orange glow of its vacuum tubes and the steady hum of its power supply reminded her that sometimes the oldest and simplest solutions are the most reliable when everything else fails. She had entered the Antarctic communication bunker as a modern digital communications specialist, but she was leaving as someone who understood the deeper principles that connected all forms of human communication across time and distance. Her grandfather's secret codes had not only saved their lives, but had also passed on a legacy of knowledge and skill that would serve her for the rest of her career.